now got, our next speaker is aroha mai whānau, Dr. Georgina Stewart. Now, I'll just a quick, te whakamohi o te kia koutou, ko whakarara te maunga, ko matauri te moana, ko te tāpui te marae, ko Ngāti kura te hapu, ko Ngāpuhi nui tonu te iwi, e hoa māho mai te pakipaki mō Georgina Stewart.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Holden. Ka mihi hoki kia koutou katoa. Mihi ki ngā kai kōrero I mua I ahau. Mihi hoki ahau ki a koe Kim, te manuhiri mai tā wāhi. I think my talk in many ways addresses some of the challenging points that you raised this morning. I put this up as my visual pepeha. This is a view from my dad's house, so while you were speaking. So haven't got time for any of the fancy stuff, we'll move right along. And my title, I took out most of my pictures when I realised how little time I had, but I just wanted to put this one up. This is the cover of a book by a very famous Māori educator who recently retired as professor from this University of Victoria. So my title was just sort of riffing off that, really. This was a somewhat challenging, really, the whole idea of putting marae within universities and all that sort of thing. And so I'm going to start from Curious Minds. It was the national strategy document from which Unlocking Curious Minds, and I think was around at the time of the National Science Challenges, so it really puts it in this context. But Curious Minds, actually, Sir Peter Gluckman, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, in this report, prior to adding his piece, which came into the looking ahead, he had already bundled within that the first report on science education, which was written by people from NZCER, Council for Educational Research, inspired by science. I mean, that's a team that's been researching science education for a very long time. And then a follow-up report to that there. And this report, looking ahead, fed into the Curious Minds strategy and the resulting funding programs, including Unlocking Curious Minds, with the aim of lifting science education. So I'm speaking here based on my 25 years of involvement since I was kaiako Pūtaiao me te pāngarau ki te wharikura o Hoani Waititi Marae. I timata hau ki reira I te tau 23, I tauatau tonu ka timata te tuhi o te pukapuka tuatahi mo te Pūtaiao. And I have to just make a disclaimer here. I have made these arguments more fully in the paper that I give you the reference for at the end of the talk. But really, hot potato. Given the importance of science and technology to our economy, science education is pretty much a perennial hot potato in this country. And one of the things that Sir Peter's report was characterised by was this desire or this ambition that scientists should get more involved with science education. And that's what I see Unlocking Curious Minds funding as being partly about, not only, of course. And, you know, in many ways, because I've been researching Pūtaiao for a very long time, and I think I've just about said all I've got to say about it in the literature, but I kind of keep getting pulled back in, and this happened to me last year when I was approached by the principal investigator scientist on a project under Unlocking Curious Minds funding. And the aim of the project, I've got in brackets in the last point, to produce a reo Māori school resource on the particular class of endemic organisms that this scientist was very passionate about. And in particularly, the person was passionate about sharing what they had collected over their years as a scientist around the traditional Māori knowledge and uses of this particular class of organisms. And they sort of expressed it to me in these terms: I want Māori students to know about the traditional pre-European uses of these organisms. So that's a noble, kind of worthy gain, but I'm going to sort of provoke, really, that. And I'm going to come back to this slide and the next one, two sentences from Gluckman's report, looking ahead. because it seems to me that I have not heard very much. I think I'm the only person that's actually picked these up and is talking about these, this kind of caution that Sir Peter placed in his report. So he talks about, he raises this question of teaching science through te reo Māori, and he asks whether it should be a priority to develop a full science lexicon in te reo, given that English is the global language of science. And he says this last bit, I acknowledge this is a very difficult issue, but one which I believe Māori educators should consider in some depth. Now, I mark that he placed that responsibility on Māori educators, because in actual fact, I think we all need to think about this, because if this kind of activity is being funded by national science challenges and by national science funding, then clearly it's not just Māori educators who are involved or who are supporting this approach to science education. And now I'm going to flick backwards to 1995, when Graham Smith issued his own challenge, an earlier challenge in this paper, and he challenged, at that point, he challenged science educators in this country that they needed to address the crisis of Māori science education, which he felt had been overlooked, although there had been decades at that point of world-class science education research taking place in this country, particularly around Waikato University and the work of people like Peter Freiberg and, I've forgotten the other guy's name, Osborne. And his prediction in this paper was that kura kaupapa Māori education would take care of the problem, but that turns out not to have been the case. And so I have, in my paper, really taken an argument from philosophy. And I just want to refer back to the last speaker who talked about we don't go around in the forest and say, oh, that bird's got a mana or this bird's got a mauri. It's the same with scientists. Scientists, in their normal course of their work, do not think or reflect about the philosophy that underpins the science that they are using every day. And I think that I've made an argument whereby I think with the best possible of intentions, science is being taught in such a way that alienates Māori and other non-Western students. But I can see I'm not going to have time to really make that argument. So there have been changes, but some things haven't changed since 20 years ago. Māori are still, it's a crisis. The crisis is the gap. Science is the worst case scenario for Māori education. I think that, so this is kind of coming to the summary, the Māori crisis is a philosophical problem. It can't really be solved by policy. Māori science creates a crisis because it is anathema to science knowledge, but it is a very powerful and even seductive idea. And so what's happening now is that in the name of creating an apparent engagement between te ao Māori and te ao science, what is the dominant approach is to translate science into te reo. But this is out of touch. Oh, hang on. I think my slides might be a bit out of order. This is really out of touch with reality because only a handful of kura, and I'm talking kura kaupapa Māori, are teaching Pūtaiao in Māori above at least year 9. And my 20 years plus in the Māori medium sector suggests to me that there's very little Pūtaiao being taught even at year 1 to 8. And so it seems to me that things like this resource that's been funded by Unlocking Curious Minds is targeting really an almost zero kind of audience, probably 150 students throughout the whole country. Now, I'll just come back to this for a couple of minutes. Science education and science teachers tend to default to presenting science as the truth and really forget about the cultural context, the messy reality that we've already heard about this morning or today. They focus on Māori needing science, and so often I've had so many conversations with non-Māori science educators that sort of focus on Māori don't understand. They need science. They need to understand how important it is, as if the only problem was motivation. But the reality is that school science presents a triumphalist narrative of science that ignores the role of science in colonisation, and this is where it connects with what Kim was saying, and also its role today in service of big business. I'm right, I'm on track. So I think I'm just about at my last slide here. What I started with, Gluckman's challenge, points to what I think is the real crisis, that the answer for Māori science education is seen as translating science into te reo. This is fuelled both by a knowledge purism, because there's no doubt that science is a very kind of bounded form of knowledge, and the linguistic purism that comes from within Māori medium education, where te reo, inga wā katoa, inga wāhi katoa, that not a word of Pākehā should be included, even to all the neologisms that have been brought in Pūtaiao. And that consumes the available resources. So in actual fact, and this is so ironic, by translating science into Māori, we give away the opportunity to look at different science and Māori perspectives, because we are consumed with the vocab, with making sure the meanings are the same. And so that's what I think is the actual policy crisis in Māori science education. And I have unpacked that argument much more, to a much better degree than what I have today for you in this paper that's forthcoming. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Georgina.
I thought I just got ripped off with time there.
No, we have got some time for questions, so I'll take the first one down here.
That you talked about, Sir Peter Gluckman talked about English being the universal working language of science, which it seems that now is, and even the French will have accepted that in terms of dropping the requirement for Latin diagnoses of new species, for example. But that struck me that it's not that long ago in the history of science that the languages of science were Latin and Greek.
Well, that was back in the Enlightenment. So actually, that's a really important point, because
I wondered if therefore the rise of international English science reflects partly the same historical processes as the colonisation that we've heard about elsewhere, and so I guess I'm supporting your co-pupper, I think, in that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. So the change from Latin to the European languages was a very key point that was part and parcel of the explosion of science that we know about post-Enlightenment, right? What was this question? I've forgotten where I was going with that, really. What I was going to say was, about 100 years ago, there were science journals, and science was definitely being done in most of the French, Italian, Russian, quite a number of languages, but that has narrowed so much. But what I do argue in my paper is that the rise of science, I call it co-evolved with modernity, as we understand modernity in a wider sense. Many of the characteristics are the same. So I do think of science as a colonising form of language, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, although one could look at the deleterious results of it, but science will take unto itself any new knowledge that it can. And in that process, it's not interested, it leaves behind the original cultural contexts. So anyway, there's a lot more to say.
Kia ora, Georgina. We'll take one more question, maybe over here.
And that's exactly why I call it a paradox. Gluckman was reflecting on what is happening, but the dominant policy approach for Māori medium science education, I referred earlier in my comment to a previous speaker, there was a debate going on in the 80s and 90s about Māori science and about the interface between mātauranga Māori and Western science. But in the field of education, by the year 2000, that had gone, and the dominant approach since then has been a translation approach.
I'm going to take one more quick question. Is it a quick question? Yeah.
One is as a māma here with the kura kaupapa from Otipoti, another with University of Otago, I'm a lecturer in Hauora Māori, and also work for the Māori Health Workforce Development Unit, where we're looking at how we get more students with sciences through to medicine. So with that in mind and listening to the other kōrero today, sustainability, how we grow our own Māori researchers, and you've posed those questions, or the kōrero around reo. What is your answer if it isn't this? Could you give me 2 pearls of wisdom, please, on how you reckon we could be doing this better for our Māori workforce development that we desperately need in our country? Kia ora.
Ai, pai tō pātai. Taku whakautu e pēnei ana, and it sounds a bit ridiculous, but I'm actually a big advocate of bilingual science. And by that I mean, my ideal vision would be for Pūtaiao to be taught to the little ones, as it is now, if it is now, in Māori. But it seems to me that around about intermediate to early secondary is where that's when we start in science education, not Māori. That's when we start to teach the language of science. And I do not think that Māori medium students should be denied that.
Ho mai te pakipaka e hoa mā, Dr. Georgina Stewart.